Welcome to Literacy in History, the Pullman Strike, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. Let's begin with some background information to set the stage for what you'll learn today. In American history, the late 19th century or 1800s is often called the Gilded Age. During this period, which coincided with the Second Industrial Revolution, industry expanded and the wealth of the nation grew tremendously. But it was also an era of tremendous income inequality. The rich got richer and richer, while the poor tended to remain that way. In many ways, industrial workers found themselves losing ground even as their labor created unprecedented wealth for their bosses. They worked long hours for low pay, often in unsafe conditions. Workers had few rights, and many felt exploited or used. If they complained, they would simply be fired. Feeling helpless and angry, some American workers formed labor unions, banding together in groups to demand better, safer, more humane working conditions. An individual could be ignored. But when workers spoke as a group, they found that they had vastly more power. From the start, unions in the United States were controversial. They were often perceived as un-American. Many of their members were recent immigrants. Unions sometimes attracted the more radical members of the workforce, like socialists or anarchists. When unions' demands went unmet, their members would sometimes strike, walking off the job in order to force their bosses to become desperate and compromise. Strikes like this disrupted the economy. Sometimes they turned violent. Many Americans, especially those outside the industrial workforce, thought that union members were troublemakers at best or dangerous at worst. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 and the Homestead Strike of 1892 both became violent episodes in the labor movement. In 1886, unions across the nation decided to march on May 1st, May Day, in support of an 8-hour workday. In Chicago, many of the participants were workers on strike from the local McCormick Reaper factory. Some clashed with police, and 2 workers were killed. In protest, radicals called for a mass rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square. "Arm yourself and appear in full force," urged the flyers they distributed. The May 4th rally began peacefully, but when police showed up and ordered the crowd to disperse, someone threw a homemade bomb into their ranks. The police responded by opening fire on the crowd. 7 policemen and 4 workers were killed, and hundreds more were injured in the Haymarket Riot. The public mostly blamed the violence on the unions. Homestead, Pennsylvania was the home of Andrew Carnegie's massive Homestead Steel Works. Many steel workers there were represented by a union, but Carnegie and his business partner Henry Clay Frick wished to break the union and have their entire workforce be non-union employees. To this end, Frick locked all the workers out of the factory, denying them their jobs. He then attempted to bring in strikebreakers, or scabs, new workers who would run the factory temporarily until the old workers, now on strike, submitted to the new conditions. Frick hired a private army, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, to secure the factory for the arrival of the new workers. But the strikers took over the factory themselves and attacked the Pinkertons. Lives were lost on both sides of the violent clash. Despite the steelworkers' victory, their strike ended after Pennsylvania's governor sent in the state militia to secure the Homestead Works for the replacement workers. The factory was reopened, but those who had participated in the strike were forbidden to return to their old jobs, even for lower wages. The failure of the Homestead strike meant that there would be no real union presence in the steel industry for the next 40 years. Now, let's learn what led to the Pullman Strike of 1894. George Pullman was an engineer and a businessman. He made his fortune in the era of train travel, inventing a sleeping car for railroads. These special train cars accommodated overnight passengers in comfort and luxury, providing them private sleeping spaces and personal service from a porter. The Pullman Company manufactured these train cars and also operated them on railroads across the United States. George Pullman founded the company in his hometown of Chicago in the 1860s, but by the 1870s he had new ideas for running his business. In 1877, Pullman moved his company out of urban Chicago and onto a 4,300-acre site south of the city on the shores of a lake. There he planned not just a new factory, but also a model town named Pullman for his workers to live in. The attractive town had parks, a church, playgrounds, a library, shops, theaters, and housing units that featured indoor plumbing and trash collection. There were no bars or saloons. Pullman believed that in the fresh country air, his employees would be clean, contented, sober, educated, and happy. Pullman's workers didn't have to live in the company town, but most chose to. In many respects, Pullman was a desirable place to live. Non-residents would even visit it as a kind of tourist attraction. But George Pullman ran the town that bore his name for profit, and rents there were as much as 20% higher than in surrounding communities. Residents of Pullman could never own their own homes or land. They could be renters only. And Pullman himself, as the landlord, could evict his tenants for any reason. He also banned town meetings and public speeches in order to keep troublemakers from rising up. So despite the town's attractive qualities, some criticized it as a kind of gilded cage for Pullman's workers. In 1894, the year the Pullman strike took place, the American economy was still reeling from a serious panic or depression that had begun in 1893. The depression impacted the Pullman Company as the demand for new railroad cars dropped steeply. To balance the losses to his company's bottom line, George Pullman laid off some workers and cut wages for others up to 30%. However, he did not lower the rents or other living expenses in the town of Pullman. This meant that many Pullman workers, the majority of whom lived in the company town, could no longer afford to make ends meet. After paying rent, which was automatically deducted from their paychecks, some employees found themselves with only pennies with which to feed their families. The workers objected to the new terms, but Pullman insisted that the renting of the dwellings and the employment of workmen are in no way tied together. He refused to lower rents or raise wages. Pullman's workers had not been unionized before this, but now, in desperation, many of them turned to a union for help, the American Railway Union, or ARU. The ARU had been founded 1 year earlier in 1893 by Eugene Debs, a politician and union leader. Debs's mission was to unionize all workers in railroad industries across the country. He was happy to take on the cause of Pullman's workers. Pullman Company workers had now organized and were represented by a union, the ARU. George Pullman responded to unionization in his factory by firing several employees he perceived to be the union's leaders. He refused to recognize the union or to bargain with its membership. In response, on May 11, 1894, many workers walked off the job, beginning a strike. Pullman responded by shutting down the entire plant. He believed his workers would soon become desperate enough to return to their old jobs and wages. But his employees now belonged to a union whose members work in all areas of the national railroad industry. The strike at Pullman's factory would soon snowball into something much bigger. In late June, with the strike ongoing, union leader Eugene Debs called for all ARU members to boycott Pullman sleeping cars nationwide. Beginning June 26th, railroad employees who were union members refused to work on trains with Pullman cars, in some cases cutting the cars loose from the trains. Other ARU members simply walked away from their jobs in protest, creating smaller strikes across the country. If the situation continued, it would mean that rail passengers could not reach their destinations, goods could not be delivered. An extended boycott threatened to paralyze the nation. In general, the federal government of the United States did not interfere in labor disputes. Businessmen like George Pullman, his workers, railroad owners, and union members were all private parties. In a capitalist economy, these parties were supposed to be able to work out their differences within the free market, without the government picking sides. But with an extended railroad boycott looming, Grover Cleveland, the President of the United States, found himself under pressure to intervene. Cleveland's Attorney General, Richard Olney, had once been a railroad lawyer, and he still received money from at least one railroad company while in office. Olney convinced President Cleveland that the railroad boycott was preventing the federal government's delivery of the mail. Because of this, he argued, it was appropriate and even necessary for the government to resolve the matter in order to get the trains and the mail moving again. At Olney's urging, a federal court issued an injunction or order that made supporting the strike or the boycott a crime punishable by arrest. When both the strike and the boycott continued, President Cleveland called out the Army, and on July 5th, nearly 8,000 troops arrived in Chicago to disperse the Pullman strike. The presence of the troops enraged the strikers, some of whom began to riot. Other Chicago residents joined what soon became a mob scene. Pullman property was destroyed and looted. On July 7th, soldiers began shooting strikers and others. As many as 30 were killed, and dozens more were wounded. Eugene Debs and other leaders of the ARU were arrested and jailed for contempt of court. With its leaders in jail, the Pullman strike soon ended, as did the national rail boycott. By July 20th, federal troops left Chicago. On August 2nd, George Pullman reopened his factory. Some former workers were rehired, but 1,600 of them were not. They had lost their jobs and their homes, with no easy way to relocate or start over. For them, the Pullman strike had been a total failure.